Kush in northern Sudan is one of the forgotten kingdoms of Africa and the ancient world. The kings of Kush reached the zenith of their power in the 8th century BC when they conquered their neighbor Egypt, and their influence extended as far as the modern-day Middle East. Sudan's capital, Khartoum, where the Blue and White Niles meet. The waters of the two rivers merge to form the mighty River Nile that flows through northern Sudan into Egypt and ends its journey there, where it joins the Mediterranean Sea. The Blue Nile starts deep in the Ethiopian highlands, and the waters of the White Nile flow from Lake Victoria in East Africa, although it probably originates from deeper inside Central Africa. The River Nile has for centuries played silent witness to the great civilizations that existed close to its banks. An unexpected game of football in the town of Karima in northern Sudan. The youngsters laugh, quite rightly, at my lack of goalkeeping skills. Personally, I don't think I'm that bad for a woman of a certain age. As I try to bridge the generation gap, so too does the town of Karima. It reaches down through the generations to a time long gone by when it was known as Kerma. And it is here that we begin the story of the Kingdom of Kush. Early humans existed in Sudan for tens of thousands of years. By about 5000 BC, we know that people in northern Sudan lived from fishing, hunting, and basic farming. And there's evidence that they raised cattle too. They lived in relatively small, independent and separate population groups. They had to be mobile so they could find good pasture for their livestock. The rich waters of the River Nile made the land fertile, which meant crops could grow easily, so farmers could settle down and develop communities. The climate began to dry out gradually, starting from about 5000 BC across northern Africa, including what is today Sudan. This drove more people into the Nile Valley in search of hospitable land. It meant there were larger centers of population which became urbanized, and a hierarchy of chiefs or princes developed. By around 2500 BC, Kerma had become the center for the people who came to be known as the Kushites. Their buildings include large structures called dafufas, which stood up to 18 meters high. The ancient site of Kerma comprises two striking edifices, both built of sun-dried mud brick. They're known as the Western and Eastern Dafufa. Behind me is the Western Dafufa, which is believed to have been a temple. The Eastern Dafufa is a funerary chapel surrounded by a cemetery of mound graves. Archaeologist and historian Dr. Abdulrahman Ali is director of Sudan's National Museum in the capital, Khartoum.
The two Dafufas in Kerma, these are two monumental mud brick monuments. They belong to the Kingdom of Kerma, which was known as the first independent national kingdom in the Sudan, developed in 2500 BC. And the kings of Kerma, they ruled Kerma for almost 1,000 years. And Kerma was known as the first and big urban center in the sub-Saharan Africa. And these two monuments, they were used as temples, used by the local community and the kings. And in this monument, we could find the first indication of the utilization of the brick in the Nile Valley, that is in Kerma. An important fact about Kerma is that Kerma, during that time, it acts as a national symbol and united all tribes of the Sudan in one agglomeration.
We learn something about the inhabitants of Kerma from their death rituals, their customs, and what kind of objects they made and used. The traditional Kerma grave, like this one, is marked by a dome-shaped tumulus of earth, outlined by a ring of black stones sprinkled over with white pebbles. The body was placed on the south side of the burial chamber. There was also pottery in the grave. Dr. Shadia Taha is a Sudanese archaeologist teaching at Cambridge University in England.
Pottery is always abundant in all archaeological sites because it doesn't decay and it survives in all environments and climates. Pottery found in Sudan gave us information about the Neolithic groups who lived in Sudan at that time, Bronze Age groups, and Iron Age groups. We know a lot of deal about the clays they use, the techniques they use, the styles, the decoration. It tells us about the complexity of the ceramics. It tells us about trade and exchange. And what we know now, that pottery was found in Sudan at 8000 BCE.
The National Museum in Khartoum has many exhibits from ancient Sudan. Between 1780 to 1580 BC, Kerma culture was vibrant. The people wore beautiful jewelry. They had bronze mirrors, stoneware, and delicate pottery. Some experts believe the ancient Sudanese were the first to develop the technique of enameling pottery. This period of ancient Sudan's history is linked to that of its neighbor to the north, Egypt. At about the same time in ancient Egypt, that is around 3000 BC, the first dynasties were establishing the rule of the pharaohs. What was the relationship like between these two close kingdoms? It was both hostile and complementary. And over the centuries, the balance of power would shift from one to the other. As Shadia Taha explains, in the writing of history, mostly by Western scholars, the importance of ancient Sudan in this relationship has been rather overlooked.
Both countries influence each other, but the Eurocentric group, they always thought of Kerma as younger than Egypt and always copying Egypt. But they didn't give Kerma the credit it deserves because Kerma was a very advanced state and its civilization predated Babylon, Rome, and Greece. So the exchange of ideas went both ways. It wasn't just a receiver of ideas from Egypt.
When relations were bad, the pharaohs of Egypt would launch raids into Kerma, and the people of Kerma also raided the Egyptians. However, when their relationship was good, trade flourished between the two kingdoms. Donkeys were used as pack animals. Unlike camels, they need a lot of water, so that supports the theory that at this time, the climate in northern Sudan was more green and humid than it is today. As well as moving goods overland, they transported them along the Nile on boats that were later dismantled. The wood was reused in Egypt for building. But trade was hampered at certain times of the year when the Nile was impassable because of its cataracts. There are 6 cataracts in the river. The first of them is here at this very spot in Aswan in southern Egypt. The other 5 are in modern-day Sudan. And as you can see behind me,
cataracts are rock formations in the river, and this meant that boats and ships would crash into them unless the waters of the Nile were high enough for them to avoid doing so. That meant that for a large part of the year, the waters of the River Nile were not navigable, so traders would have to use overland routes, and this was more arduous and took a longer time.
Throughout history, the cataracts on the Nile gave the people of ancient Sudan a good natural defense from attackers coming by boat. Kerma laid the bedrock for the civilization of the Kushites.
Kush was well known for its very powerful army. They were very fierce archers, and the Egyptians called them the land of the bow because of their skills in the bow. So they know their ability and their strength and their power. In 1650, the Kushites ransacked Egypt, but they just went back. Kush was a powerful state, and the Egyptians feared Kush.
So during this period of history, the Kushites succeeded in increasing their control of trans-African trade through the Sahara to the detriment of Egypt. For thousands of years, camel trains have made this journey from the south across the Sahara to Egypt. These camels are resting by the roadside and taking water in Dongola, in territory that would have been part of the Kingdom of Kush.
Kush was a vital crossroads for trade in the ancient world, linking the west and the east in the Red Sea, and then from the south to the north in the Mediterranean.
The overland route through the hot terrain was difficult in the past and still is today. This man tells me they've ridden from Darfur in western Sudan and are on their way to Cairo. That's a distance of nearly 2,000 kilometers.
40 يوم 45 يوم وانت بادي من وين؟ على السلامة.
I wish him well on his journey to Egypt and bid him goodbye. Trade across land and along the Nile was, of course, a critical source of wealth, and so the Egyptians wanted to regain control of this trade route to restore their fortunes. By 1550 BC, ancient Egypt was at the start of a new golden age, and powerful rulers like Queen Hatshepsut and Tutmosis III made it their mission to build up Egypt's trade again. Tutmosis III sent an army up the Nile and defeated the people at Kerma. Now Egypt could take full advantage and exploit the kingdom's resources. A new kingdom arose further south from Kerma in Napata, or Nabta as the Sudanese call it.
My own opinion, they moved to Nabta for economic, political, and religious reasons. Economic reasons because Nabta was a meeting place for trade. The population was growing. They were already urban. They needed more resources. More resources were available in the south to supply an increasing population. And religious reason, Jabal Barkal is a sacred mountain which Egyptians and Kushites believe that Amun resides in Jabal Barkal.
The god Amun-Ra.
The god Amun-Ra. So it is sacred for the Egyptians and the Kushites.
The Kushites' new kingdom at Napata is near the modern-day town of Karima by a mountain known today as Jabal Barkal. Their move coincided with another decline in Egypt, which had become so engulfed in its own internal rivalries that it paid little attention to Kush. This meant the kingdom at Napata, which began in El Kuru, could develop undisturbed.
As the civilization of Nabta evolved from Al-Kuru, it starts as a small chiefdom and developed to a kingship and later on developed to an empire.
By the 8th century BC, the kings of Kush were growing ever richer and more powerful. At the Kushite capital of Napata, the mountain dominated the landscape, much as it does today. In its shadow, life goes on in Al-Kuru. Time, I think, to abandon the open desert in search of human inhabitants. I want to get a feel for the kind of settlements that existed in the ancient kingdom of Kush and how far some of the ancient customs and practices still exist in modern-day Sudan.
So I've been asking the ladies of the house to show me things which I know were used in the era of the Kushites and which I know are still used today. And this is what's known as a zir, and this was used in ancient times to keep water cool. So I find it absolutely fascinating that I can find an old house like this that is just so evocative of that period of Sudanese history. You can see the traditions of the Kushite kingdom still living on in the people who inhabit this area.
People here eat the same grains and use similar earthenware storage urns. And the style of beds is one that has been in continuous use since ancient times.
I remember beds like this from decades ago in the Sudan, but of course people have since moved on and tend to use mattresses, which is why I suppose why this has just been used as a repository for dates.
So the wooden bed have an important significance to the Sudanese community through the whole period from Karma, from 2500 BC up to now, because it have a significance in the daily life for wedding, bride and groom. The ceremony started on a wooden bed, we call it angareb, and even for the circumcision of the boys, it was used. And finally, it was used to carry the deceased. If somebody dies, he will be carried to his final destination by a bed.
I've come across a wedding party in a settlement at the foot of Jabal Barkal. The men are gathered waiting for the ceremony to start. I reckon I can seize the chance to go and visit the women at the wedding breakfast to see some female customs that have endured throughout the centuries.
ازيكم اهلا وسهلا عايزه اسلم على العريس ازيك هداك العريس شكرا.
The bridegroom very helpfully takes me across the road to meet the ladies.
I'm just looking at this lady's hands with the henna and the beautiful gold. Two things that we had, of course, in the Kushite kingdom, the gold and then, of course, the henna. The women of Kush dipped their hands in henna, decorated it, and they also wore coal on their eyes, like this lady here. And this is the holder that the coal is kept in today. And the bridegroom's aunt, Samira, is going to show us how they would use it. Amazing, she did it without any mirror.
Kushite women, like one famous princess who lived in the 8th century called Amenirdes, wore elaborate jewelry. She probably had fine gold rings, bracelets, and colourful beaded necklaces like these in the National Museum, some made of ostrich eggshells. Amanirdes would have worn her hair flat to the head with a top knot, her long nails stained with henna, and her eyes darkened with kohl. So you can see the continuity of tradition is very much alive amongst the women at the wedding preparations. And you can also see it in the very masculine pursuit of wrestling, an activity which has stood the test of time. The Kushites were renowned wrestlers and were held in high esteem for their skill and fighting ability. Today in Sudan, especially in the Nuba Mountains in the southwest of the country, wrestling tournaments are held regularly. In days gone by, the Kushites would have engaged in such wrestling matches for sport. These local young men are clearly letting off a bit of steam as well as entertaining spectators. By the early 8th century BC, ancient Egypt's fighting capability was much diminished. The country had grown weak and it could no longer ward off invaders. Egypt came under the rule of princes from Libya who had their own traditions and religion and had no regard whatsoever for those of the Egyptians. This was a source of great dismay for the Kushites. Through centuries of interaction, the Kushites had a religion and culture similar to the ancient Egyptians. They spoke their own Cushitic language, though they used Egyptian hieroglyphics for writing. By 750 BC, the Kushites had had enough of the decadence of the Libyan princes and their allies in Egypt. At that time, Kush was ruled by a king called Kashta, and he believed it was his duty to save the Egyptians from further ruin. So he decided to invade Egypt. We don't have any depiction of Kashta, but presumably he was not unlike the kings who succeeded him. Kashta's ambitions in Egypt were limited. He simply wanted to protect the religious center of Thebes, modern-day Luxor, in southern or upper Egypt. King Kashta was a force to be reckoned with. He owned the gold mines in Kush and controlled the River Nile and land routes for luxury goods like ebony and ivory from further south in Africa. At his base in Napata, between the third and fourth cataracts of the River Nile, around 450 kilometers north of the modern-day capital Khartoum, Kashta ruled over a flourishing community of Kushites. King Kashta's main place of worship was at the nearby temple of Jabal Barkal. From a distance, it's imposing, and as you get nearer, you can begin to make out the well-preserved remains of the temple. Kashta's army was renowned for the skill of its horsemanship and its archers, who would dip their arrowheads into poison to make them more deadly. Their speciality was to shoot their opponents in the eye. Kashta's army first took Thebes, the religious capital of Egypt. For the most part, the Kushites were welcomed by the locals there, grateful that their co-religionists were seeing off the heathen Libyans. With Thebes secured, Kashta could rest easy. 3 years after he'd begun the campaign into Egypt, King Kashta died. He was buried in Al-Kuru in his homeland of Kush.
Kashta's body was mummified in the Egyptian fashion and placed in a highly decorated wooden coffin covered in gold foil with inlays of coloured glass and lapis lazuli. His body was placed facing east in the direction of which the sun rose, and the coffin was placed in a grave like this, above which a huge pyramid would have stood.
As befits a dead king, Kashta would need a large number of grave goods for the afterlife. Pottery, personal ornaments and jewellery were buried with him beneath his pyramid. The Kushite pyramids differ from those in Egypt. They're smaller, steeper, and made of red sandstone. There are 1,000 pyramids pyramids that have been discovered so far in Sudan, though only about 300 of them are still standing as pyramid structures. In Egypt, there are about 100 pyramids.
Our pyramids, the Sudanese pyramids, have different aspects because their angle of building is very steep compared to that of Egypt.
We know that the kings and queens of Kush were buried with all manner of personal belongings and furniture, and also shabtis, which are these figures of people who would serve them in the afterlife. Were they actually ever buried with real live human beings?
This is the idea of accompanying the deceased, because in one grave, in 1916, in one of the kings of Karma grave, some of the deceased were covering their faces with their hands. So it means that these people were maybe put into the grave, intoxicated or drugged, and put to accompany the king. In the later period, there is no indication of intentional accompanying of the king, but they put the shabtis to serve the king in the afterlife.
These pyramids here by Jebel Barkal are an example of how pyramids were looted both in antiquity and in centuries later to come. The tips of these pyramids are believed to have been covered in gold foil, where clearly now the tips have been destroyed and the gold removed.
Kashta's reign as king of Kush had lasted around 13 years. However, it was his son Pianki who was to take further the mission his father had started. Pianki was crowned king at Temple of Amun in Jebel Barkal, probably in 747 BC, and he ruled for about 30 years until around 715 BC. Much of our knowledge of Pianki comes from his stela, a massive slab of dark grey granite with 159 lines of text in Egyptian hieroglyphics, known as the Victory Stela. It sets out how Pianki first defeated and then ruled Egypt through establishing separate principalities. The stela begins with Pianki's words.
Hear of what I did. I am a king, divine emanation, living image of Atum, who came forth from the womb adorned as a ruler, of whom those greater than he were afraid, whose father knew and whose mother recognized that he would rule.
Under Pianki, Egypt came further under Kushite control. However, when he heard about a key victory by his army, he was not content, because some of the Egyptian princes had escaped to the north of the country. Pianki vowed to go into battle himself, as recorded in his stela.
I shall make the Northland taste the taste of my fingers.
Pianki pursued the Egyptian princes north and laid siege to them in their stronghold of Hermopolis. They eventually surrendered. After his victory, Pianki searched through the palace for treasures. When he went into the stables and saw the horses had become emaciated during the siege, he was furious with the Egyptian prince.
I swear that as Ra loves me, as my nostrils are rejuvenated with life, it is more grievous in my heart that the horses have suffered hunger than any other evil deed that thou hast done in the prosecution of thy desire.
The Kushites were excellent horsemen and prized their best specimens. As his favorite horses died off, Pianki would have them buried near the royal tomb that had been built for him. On his return to Napata in Kush, Pianki took with him architects and sculptors from Egypt, and he went about extending and reinforcing the great temple at Jebel Barkal. This is a computer-generated image of what the temple would have looked like. Pianki ruled for nearly a decade after his campaign in Egypt. He died around 715 BC.
Like other Kushite kings before him, King Pianki was buried here at this site in Al-Kuru in a tomb surmounted by a pyramid built like this. In the centuries to come, his tomb was plundered, but we know that Pianki was buried with many valuables. Fragments of furniture were found, a fine bronze stand, amulets bearing his name, and most importantly, 4 of his favorite horses were buried with him, entombed standing, their collars decorated with silver, plumes, and beads, to serve their master forever in the afterlife.
After Pianki died, the throne passed to his younger brother Shabaka, who succeeded in conquering all of Egypt. He moved his capital to Thebes. By now, the powerful Kushites had attracted the attention of the warlike Assyrians, who were threatening King Hezekiah of Judah. He appealed to Shabaka for help, and he succeeded in warding them off. Kush was established as an African superpower. When Shabaka died in 702 BC, he was succeeded by his son Shabitku, who again managed to see off the Assyrians. When Shabitku died in 690 BC, the kingdom passed peacefully to his brother Taharqa.
Well, inside the temples here at Jebel Barkal, you have these very rich decorations on the wall. And here on this wall, you have one of the greatest kings of Kush, Taharqa, making an offering of necklaces, probably gold, to the god Amun-Ra, who is here. After Thebes was defeated by the kings of Kush, they assumed the style and the trappings of a pharaoh, and they became lord of the 2 lands. Now, to represent that, if you look at the top of Taharqa's head, he's got what are known as the twin uraei, and uraei are the 2 serpent shapes that you can see representing Egypt and the land of Kush. And the kings of Kush wore a tight-fitting crown, which was actually a skull cap made of leather or metal, with the sacred serpent symbols on them, and there's a cord necklace falling over the shoulders or down the back. And the kings of Kush are often depicted wearing a kilt, and the Kushites wore shoes or sandals. The poorer citizens went barefoot, but as a king, Taharqa's sandals would have been made of leather, usually with a high curving strap extending along the entire foot and curving over the toes to meet the soles. And on special occasions, their sandals might be coloured in red, yellow, or green with decorations stamped on them in a snake pattern.
Like the kings before him, Taharqa was engaged in bloody rivalry with the Assyrians. This time, that's around 670 BC, King Esarhaddon ruled Assyria. In their first military encounter, Taharqa defeated the Assyrians, but in a second battle in Egypt itself, the key city of Memphis fell to the Assyrians. Taharqa was wounded, and he withdrew from the battlefield and headed south to Thebes, where the Assyrians did not pursue him. Safe in southern Egypt, Taharqa could embark on a huge building program, and the evidence is still clear at the Temple of Karnak today.
This column is the only one standing at its original height of the 10 pillars built by Taharqa at Karnak. And this is yet further evidence of the impact of the Kushites' building program in ancient Egypt. The sacred lake at Karnak Temple is a large rectangular basin, and its waters come from the River Nile. Although it was already here when the Kushites took control of Thebes, it owes its current shape to Taharqa. After an eventful life, Taharqa died probably in Egypt. But he wasn't buried in the royal cemetery at Al-Kuru, but here in nearby Nuri. He chose the highest spot in the area for his pyramid, which is the biggest of those still standing. Some archaeologists believe that it was originally enclosed in a much bigger monument.
Taharqa may not in the end have been able to prevent the Assyrian conquest of Memphis and the Nile Delta. The combined might of the Assyrians and their Egyptian allies proved too much for him, but his power and standing were recognized even many centuries after his death. In fact, he's mentioned twice in the Bible. After Taharqa's death, the crown passed to his nephew, Tantamani. Tantamani became king at what could hardly be described as an auspicious time. Part of his kingdom was in the hands of the Assyrians and their Egyptian proxies. Tantamani decided to go to Memphis, not far from modern-day Cairo, to try to reclaim the city for the Kushites. Tantamani captured Memphis back from the Assyrians and restored his dynasty's glory, but his pride was short-lived. The Assyrians took the religious city of Thebes. They looted and utterly destroyed it. But deterred by the harsh climate, the Assyrians did not venture further south beyond Thebes and retreated. The loss of Thebes severely undermined Tantamani's prestige. He returned to Kush humbled, but he remained king there until his death. His defeat by the Assyrians marked the end of Egypt's rule by the Kushite kings. They had formed the 25th dynasty of the pharaohs of Egypt, a period that had lasted nearly 100 years. The balance of power now shifted back to Egypt.
The defeat of the Kushites in Egypt meant the sun had set on the golden era of the kings of Kush. They never returned to Egypt, but they did continue to govern in Kush, here in northern Sudan, for another 1,000 years.
The Kushites built a new base called Meroe, about 250 kilometers north of Khartoum, an area known today as Al-Bajrawiya, and not to be confused with the modern city of Meroe. This is the royal cemetery of Meroe, but it wasn't until the 3rd century BC that the kings and queens of Kush were buried here. The Kushites quickly developed a new and prosperous kingdom here. People began to farm as well as rearing livestock, and Meroe became a central point for commerce. An abundance of iron ore led to the working of iron.
Because metal at that time was very precious, they traded it. Their trade included Egypt, through Egypt to the Mediterranean. It went to India and China and to the rest of Africa. And that is why they became wealthy. Caravans and the trade in iron, beads, and glass and linen. Because they had the iron ore, they had the river Nile, they had water, and they had organizations. Ironwork in Meroe is equivalent to industrial revolution in the West.
The royal family lived here at the royal city. The buildings included a palace, a library, and baths.
The royal city is the best preserved part of the ancient city of Meroe. All around you, you can see the remnants of buildings, monuments, and structures of a civilization that at its height enjoyed all the attributes of urban life. This would have been one of the finest tombs and pyramids at the Royal Cemetery in Meroe. It was for Queen Amani Shahito, who ruled Meroe at the end of the 1st century BC. It was full of fine jewels and other belongings to serve her in the afterlife. But her tomb was plundered by the Italian archaeologist Fellini in the 19th century. And after her bath, Queen Amani Shahito and other members of the royal family would just walk a few steps, come here, sit on one of these chairs, and enjoy a good massage. Where's my masseur?
The queens of Kush at Meroe had a powerful role. Unlike the ancient Egyptians, women could succeed as monarchs in their own right, or they could rule jointly with their husbands or sons. And the king's relationship with his mother was of extreme significance. What do we know about Queen Amani Shahito?
Queen Amani Shahito, we know about her jewelry. She was covered in jewelry, and she used to love, well, all Kushites women loved gold and jewelry. She was a large lady. I have this mug, which depicted her in most of the temples and the cemetery as a very large woman. This is for two reasons. Large ladies, it is a symbol of prosperity and a symbol of affluence. That means she was well-fed and she wasn't starved. The other thing I believe that, because if you could see here in this mug, she is fighting an enemy who is shown as smaller than her, and she was really towering over him. So that could be another reason, maybe exaggerating it, the size in these carvings a little bit, but they were still plump. Because
So they were powerful ladies, yeah. Queen Amani Renas actually fought the Romans. Pretty powerful warrior queens, weren't they?
Yes, they led armies, and they used to go and really do lots of raids in southern Egypt. So the fights between the Romans and the Kushites continued. Queen Amaniras, in one of the battles, she was blinded in one eye, so she became the queen with one eye. And in the year 22 BCE, the Romans make a treaty which benefits the Meroites, just to stop the fights between the two of them.
At Meroe, the Kushites embarked on a big building program. You can see here at the ancient site of Musawarat clear evidence of temples and we think also palaces and other monuments. The Kushites interacted with other civilizations, ancient Romans, the Greeks also, and you can actually see this quite clearly in the influence, for instance, of ancient Greek architecture in this column here behind me. Until the 2nd century BC, the Kushites had written in ancient Egyptian, and then they introduced their own form of hieroglyphics, which is also pictographic, like the ancient Egyptian one. And it's one of the great mysteries of the Kushites. We just simply cannot read their Meroitic language. We have an idea of what it might have sounded like, but we can't understand it. Why did the Kushites introduce their own hieroglyphics? Well, we believe it's because the population formed in smaller groups and began to move around, and so they needed to communicate with one another.
The Meroitic era of ancient Sudan boasts many fine buildings which showed the Kushites lived in some style in this period. In the mid-1st century AD, King Natakamani and his wife Queen Amanitere were prolific builders at the site of Naka. There were statues to Epedimac, the lion god. The Kushites worshipped the same gods as the ancient Egyptians, however, Epedimac was unique to them. But the success and riches of Meroe attracted envy from a powerful new kingdom called Aksum, in what we refer to today as the Horn of Africa. The Aksumites put Kush under pressure, contributing to its decline in the 4th century AD. The fall of Kush meant a glorious chapter in the history of ancient Sudan and Africa came to an end. In the next programme, we find out about the Kingdom of Aksum, what led to its rise, and why it was described as one of the 4 great civilizations of the ancient world.